Welcome to the Wisdom Of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the Wisdom of Rosie Batty. I want to talk about Rosie in a minute, and I really want to do that in detail because it's really important that people get a deep understanding of where Rosie's coming from and why she's such an important guest for the Wisdom Of. But we live in an increasingly complex world, socially, politically, economically. There's a lot going on for people right now. And within that complexity, there's also a trend in the world for more superficial thinking. How do we influence things? And we need deeper thinkers today. We need wiser thinkers. We need deeper levels of wisdom applied to complex, contentious, challenging issues that we faced with. And the thinkers at that level, I think, will be the people that lead a renaissance of wisdom. And sometimes that thinking has to address challenging and uncomfortable conversations. In fact, that might be the most important time that this deeper level of thinking addresses. And so the goal of this show is to unpack what that thinking looks like and to learn lessons from the people that have been thrust into or have chosen to step into the Renaissance of Wisdom and being one of the leaders of that kind of thinking. And so today, I'd like to welcome Rosie Batty to the conversation. Rosie, thank you for giving us this time. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the conversation because it's a very important conversation that you've been leading for 10 years now. But I think the secondary conversation is how do people become an influencer of deeper thinking across difficult and challenging conversations. So I really appreciate you giving this time. And thank you for joining us on the show.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
And so 10 years ago, Rosie suffered the unimaginable loss of her son, Luke, who was 11 at the time, at the hands of his father. Devastating circumstance to have. But from the outset, Rosie wanted to make sure her story wasn't really went beyond her personal grief and actually had some kind of meaningful impact, and was thrust into the spotlight in the media and thrust into the spotlight as a courageous and tireless, in many ways, strong crusader against family violence. And so not something you would do by choice, but she's given voice to thousands of family violence sufferers and victims, and her impact has been extraordinary. For those of you in Australia, we have a lot of overseas viewers and guests, but for those of you in Australia, I doubt there's anyone in Australia today that doesn't know the name Rosie Batty, if not for the story, but for the reach that she's had with what she's trying to do. She was appointed as the inaugural chair of the Victorian Government's Victim Survivors Advisory Council and set up in response to the country's first Royal Commission into Family Violence, and determined to put family violence at the centre of policy decision-making, which often is where this real change needs to occur. Named Australian of the Year, and receiving the Pride of Australia National Courage Medal and the prestigious Order of Australia. Not insignificant recognition of the work that she's been doing. And her accolades speak volumes about the indelible mark that she's made in our world. Her relentless dedication has also seen her inducted into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women and named by Fortune magazine as one of the world's top 50 greatest leaders, which is incredible, and voted as the most influential person in the not-for-profit sector on Pro Bono Australia's Impact 25 list, not once, but twice. Holds an honorary doctorate from the University of the Sunshine Coast for her contribution to raising national awareness and action concerning family violence. I think, but perhaps her most enduring legacy lies in her innate ability to inspire others I was just listening to Rosie's press conference earlier, where she was speaking to the National Press Gallery in Australia. And, when you have a number of journalists in absolute silence and a pin can drop in the room, these are people are looking for a story and they're just sitting and listening, this innate ability to inspire other people and bring a conversation, Rosie, that sometimes people don't want to have. I mean, you found yourself thrust into this spotlight, right? Trying to have a conversation that maybe half the population don't want to have for obvious reasons. And you bring some extraordinary data to the table just around I don't think Australia is probably that different to a lot of other countries in the world, but some of the data you bring to the table about what's happening here in Australia, and I think for context, we should kind of get a head around some of those things. I'd love, I don't want to drag everybody down, but this is a big conversation we need to be having, right?
Look, it is. And I guess, for me, I've been saying the same things pretty much now for 10 years, which, at times has got quite, I guess, tiring
Yeah.
because, I think when, as you say, I was thrust into this spotlight and without any kind of agenda or plan or any vision for where I was heading or what I was really trying to do other than make sure that, my own individual way, that other people didn't go through what I was going through. But we have one woman a week being murdered. Right now, it's been a catastrophic start to the year because we've of more recent weeks have had to, the statistics have been such that it's one woman every 4 days is being murdered. So I guess for me, I'm still surprised that people don't know what an enormous problem it is across our society, across all kinds of suburbs and postcodes and areas where we all live. But yes, I guess, unless you have been directly affected in some way, it's not something you necessarily have tuned into, or you haven't realized that you maybe have a responsibility to take more notice and improve your understanding. So yes, it's 1 in 3, one woman a week on average being murdered, and 1 in 3 women experiencing physical violence in their lifetime. And most sadly as well, it's 1 in 4 children that are impacted by family violence, which means, their future and their potential can be seriously impacted. And sometimes those children do go on to become perpetrators of violence or find themselves also in relationships where they are victims of family violence. And so the generations and that are impacted by family violence continue to evolve.
They're such confronting numbers, and we know the majority of that is done by men. So, it's a conversation that chunks of the population would rather not have. And 1 in 3 women is a staggering number. And then 1 every 4 days at the moment. And we report the road toll regularly because people are worried about how many people die in car accidents. And we're not reporting that number in the same way. And it's probably because it's an uncomfortable conversation for people. And yet you've been repeating the same thing for 10 years, which also means it's not changing at a rate that I suspect you'd like to see it change, and actually the rate that we should all want to see this thing change. I know that you've said it's not a women's and children problem. It's not that women and children are doing the wrong things, or we need to teach them how to be safer or whatever. This is actually a societal problem, and it's the way you had this great kind of phrase that you said that, it's behind all of this is a level of inequality. And the antidote to that is actually equality, which has to start well before, the family violence starts to present itself. I'd love to that's a deeper level of understanding maybe than people apply to this. And I'd love to explore that thinking a little bit. Everyone can play a role, but you've got to find a place to start, right? And it's not enough to say, well, I don't think that's happening in my family with anyone I know, so we're good. You've got to have the conversations and be happy to have them. How would we equip people with some of that thinking? Underneath it is a level of inequality, a level of, you're not worth as much. Therefore, I can do this, or we don't have to think about as much. And the antidote is equality. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Really, a more gender equal world is where violence towards a woman is less likely to occur. And it really comes from the patriarchal world that we live in, and the man who has, in previous generations and in previous times been the head of the family, the decision maker, the income earner, and you know, women are perceived as property and as perceived as possessions. And so there is an entitlement that runs deeply. And I think that we're all part of an evolving society that I didn't have these conversations when I was a young person. I didn't ever have these conversations. I didn't see anything different between myself and my brothers necessarily. But, you know, I reflect back of being a little girl growing up on a farm in the UK and realise as I reflect back just how differently I was treated as the daughter to my brothers and the expectations around that. And I also then can see how that played out with my aunties and uncles. So really, it's a time where more and more women, as we see the importance of women having access to the same opportunities as our male counterparts. We seek to be paid the same amount of money for doing the same job. We seek to remove the barriers that have always been there that kind of prevent us and restrict us from having the same opportunity. So, you know, a lot has been achieved in my lifetime, and I'm sure it has with you, Simon, as you look back at the women's place in either a corporate world or any area of workplace. And, you know, there's certain industries where women are overwhelmingly dominant in those industries, but most likely not to be in the upper areas of executive management and CEO status. And so, yeah, we're all, I think, on a journey where we're starting to recognise just how women have had to fight for even the vote, access to going into pubs and male places, and that journey still continues. And so, you know, violence is on a spectrum, and it's also different forms, you know, where people seek to control each other. And I think the worst of those outcomes is when a person is murdered. And when I first started talking 10 years ago, it was an incredibly uncomfortable thing to say. It is predominantly men committing this violence. It was really very uncomfortable, and people really did not want to hear that. And our stats are clear, 94% of perpetrators are men. So the conversation has shifted, you know, and I think certainly when I did speak out, family violence wasn't a topic covered in newspapers. It didn't make headlines. And I was that person that for the very first time spoke to the media and put it into the context of family violence. And that is what changed everything. Finally, I was an example of a middle-class woman that again defied a lot of the stereotypes of what people, you know, expect family violence victims to look like and be. So a lot of myths around that, a lot of victim blaming. Yeah. So this was this is a culture that has, you know, has been, I mean, it's quite appalling when we reflect back that previous generations of women had no support, no help. There was that, you know, saying, you make your bed, you lie in it. So the shame was placed on the woman because of the violence. There was no shame placed on the perpetrator of the violence. It was somehow she's caused it, you know, somehow she must have done something to provoke him. And so we have this unconscious bias to minimize the risk for the woman and to blame her for being somehow party to this, for the choices she's making. And we have always done this with women who may have got murdered walking home at night time, or going to their car, or because of this length of their skirt, or being overcome by alcohol. You know, we look at blaming the
or just
woman.
shouldn't be walking by themselves at night.
And the onus of safety has always been placed
Yes.
onto the victim. And what I and many people like me have tried to do is shift that thinking, shift what we that victim blaming to, rather than question why doesn't a woman leave, to why is the perpetrator of violence, which is most often a man, choosing to be violent. And those women that are murdered, it is when they choose to leave a violent relationship. They're either making steps to leave or they have left. And that's, that power and control is unfortunately what drives their partner or ex-partner, the person who's supposed to have had an intimate relationship and love them, to committing these, ending that person's life.
And I get into these conversations with people, but actually people will do what I did just a few minutes ago, which is, oh, and you shouldn't walk alone at night by yourself. It's such an uncomfortable thing. We almost need to lighten it somehow. And yet the conversation has to go deep to really get to it. You've actually got to have that discomfort in the conversation. I wonder, did you use the word murdered 10 years ago when you first started speaking about this? And if you did, I suspect that would have been a triggering word for a lot of people. Even today, replacing family violence with she or the children were murdered, or something that could be, seen as an overstrong word. Like, how do we have, there's a discomfort, and you've led a conversation around a really uncomfortable topic for 10 years now. You've probably been in so many different scenarios where there were varying degrees of comfort, discomfort, willingness, unwillingness to have the conversation. What's changed for you over time, over that 10 years? We still got a lot of work to do on the issue. What's changed for you over that time in terms of being able to advocate for this? 10 years ago, you're the first one really in a very public way, but now we see more reported, not enough. But what's changed in the world of advocacy for you on tough issues over that 10 years that you've seen?
Well, I think there's a lot more, family violence has now become much more of a widespread conversation, a mainstream conversation across, speaking in the context of Australia. It's also something that workplaces and organisations have understood that they have a role to play as well. And so you see large organisations like banks and others who have large female workplace force, many staff, and they've realised that not only do their customers come in, and if you have 1 in 3 women being affected in some way, that means potentially their clients are going to be struggling in some way or another. It also means that their staff may be impacted, and that may affect their performance or their attendance and things like this. So you've got different leave entitlements that have now been introduced, where lots of organisations will offer a victim of family violence 10 days paid leave, so that they can actually perhaps may use that to attend court, it may use that to find somewhere else to live, they may use that for a variety of reasons. So, this is a journey again where organisations who are not experts in this area are still learning how to handle it more sensitively, and perhaps in ways that don't victim blame or breach confidentiality. So, but with that, there is an increased appreciation of how important it is that workplaces also are influences of culture, and bullying isn't tolerated in the workplace anymore, neither is sexual harassment. So, years ago when I first started working in offices and places like that, most young women at some point or another in their working lives have had uncomfortable and downright inappropriate behaviours that they've had to either accept and tolerate. But now younger generations of women don't have to do that, and there would be recourse and ramifications. And that's only very recently. We still have problems, but there is a lot more likelihood now for you to be supported and for something to happen when you speak out. We're seeing a lot more with sporting codes, because the culture of toxic masculinity from sporting codes was really appalling. Now we see players still finding themselves in the headlines, but we're making them accountable, not just for their behaviour on the field, but for their behaviour in their personal lives as well. And that's really important, because how they respect or disrespect and conduct themselves, as significant role models that younger people and everybody look up to, is another real influencer for us to be able to see change. And that's not just with family violence, that's with racism and homophobia as well. So these are the things that we start to see being people called out. It can be quite uncomfortable when you see people's careers pretty much almost ruined, or certainly seriously impacted, because of the way they're conducting it themselves and their refusal to see their behavior and their attitudes are harmful, and really there is no place. And so when you see that, I think being certainly I recognise that much more on a daily basis when I'm watching the television. I think that younger people, I think, are very good now at perhaps letting you know when you're being politically incorrect, or seeing the hypocrisy in how you're conducting yourself and what you're saying. And so I have great hope with the younger generations. But we still got a long way to go, and we really need to work how to continue to build on those shifting and changing ways of seeing each other. So we're still battling, I think, our place in the world, and it seems like there's a view, and maybe that some men see that they're losing something, but all I see is the world gains so much when we treat each other with equal respect and regard, and include, whether it's because whether our color or our culture or our age, our disability, having everybody welcomed and invited in to share space, whatever that looks like, is a world that we should all really be embracing. And yet we seem to push back against all of this change that is inevitable. I just think it's an absolute inevitability, but it's different to what we've known, and so we hold on to, I guess, what we feel that we've known, and distrust.
There's a principle kind of in this concept of stewardship, where you're not just leading the current generation, you're trying to lead multiple generations beyond you. So, 3 generations down the track, people will be better off because of something you did today, and they won't even realize that you were the starting point for that. So, generationally, every generation, we need people that come along that rattle the cage, because of that incremental, we've just gotten used to this. And I feel like there's a lot of people talk about win-win. We want win-win. You can't, great stewards understand that you can't get to win-win unless, of course, you make sure that no one's losing. And, that's the challenge. If we want to solve a problem, but we're not willing to make sure that no one's going to lose in this, that everyone's okay, this equality piece, it's going to be really challenging. And accountability is the starting point. Life is about accountability. What are the consequences of your actions? And I'm not sure that we, picking up on what you're saying about that, accountability allows you to take action, which allows you to be an advocate. So there's a whole lot that you've been unpacking there, that I think if people really looked at it through the lens of, this is real experience talking, in terms of your story, real experience thrust into the spotlight, and you've had to find your way through, where you were one of the very early voices about family violence. We can go and study advocacy and engagement, or we could listen to real experience. which is what you're talking about, the challenging conversations, the hard conversations. You've got to keep getting it in front of people and so on. A thought occurred to me while you were speaking. You must have had conversations with people, either one-to-one or in a group setting, where there were real opponents, for want of a better word, or people speaking against, you know, what you were trying to share with them. And maybe very early in the piece, where after the conversation, that person or those people had really come to a point of understanding of what you were talking about and what you were sharing. I don't know if any of those sort of circumstances have happened for you, where you've seen a turnaround in people just through the conversations you were having. And I'd be interested to unpack what some of those, you know, what some of those situations were like, and what do you think you did at the time that managed to create that? And I don't know if any are popping to mind for you at the moment or not.
Well, I think what you're talking about stewardship, and that is exactly what I see is happening right now. The changes that I would have loved to have seen overnight it doesn't happen like that. And so the changes that perhaps many of us are advocating and in through varying ways of influence and education and awareness raising are really likely to be benefiting grandchildren right now that may not have the same barriers of equality that that I have known throughout my lifetime and previous generations of women. So yes, change takes a long time, and we're doing it for the future generations, really. Generally, people may have been surprised, but I get the impression that they were ready to hear more or ready to hear more. But I think where it becomes uncomfortable is placing the blame on men about their need to change their behaviors, because what will be a common response is women are violent too. So it's like the absolute discomfort of this 94% of perpetrators are men is too uncomfortable for us to sit with. And so, you know, so we need to deflect that by reminding us that women are also capable of being unpleasant, being violent, being abusive as well. And so that's not something that I would say I would disagree with. I think humans are capable of great cruelty and abuse and neglect to children and others. But what it is a deflection from the real conversation, which is how do we engage with men? How do we influence the changes that we need to see? And not all men would recognize themselves of having problematic behaviors, because it's not just physical violence, and not all violence ends in a homicide, but there are many, many relationships that live in fear or in very controlling circumstances, and psychological abuse, financial abuse, and all these other forms of abuse that we've started to be more informed about and recognise. And really, one of the biggest barriers to a woman leaving is where do you go if you can't get a rental property, can't afford a mortgage?
Yeah, correct.
You know, so it's really complex, and it's there aren't simple solutions, and there isn't one thing to fix it. It's a combination of lots of different things, but we do, you know, we do require strong leadership, and of course that comes from, you know, we do need political leadership. We need lots of things to come into play with funding and resourcing and expertise and all of the things that it's really mind-blowing just how little investment the government and previous governments have put into this sector that have worked tirelessly over many decades to keep women and children safe, and we still struggle for adequate and secure funding. And, you know, you can't, you know, when we look at, and you're talking about language, murder or killing, and how, you know, uncomfortable that seems. Well, why do we place family or domestic in front of the word violence?
Yeah.
As if somehow, oh, it's not as bad because
Correct.
it's family. And I think those are the things that we're kind of waking up to and saying, it's never okay for someone to be unsafe, but it's certainly not okay for it to be in your own home, where you should be safer than anywhere, you know. And so I think there's a lot about the way that we speak and the language we use that is important to reflect on and challenge. And I have in the past, and more recently I've been reminded, I called it terrorism, because, you know, if you say family terrorism, that sounds a lot more serious and take note than family violence. And yet we are more likely to be terrorized and impacted by the terrorism in our own home than from overseas. And that, you know, those stats are really quite, when you compare how much we spend to protect our nation and our country and what we spend on protecting our women and children is insignificant in comparison. So, you know, there are many things around family violence, building more refugees, putting people into prison, you know, and all of those things. We do need to make perpetrators of violence accountable. We do need to have safe places for women and children to go. But we have to stop violence before it starts.
Yeah.
And that's the long generational work too. That in Victoria, you know, we did have a Royal Commission, and I'm really proud of the progress and the leadership that the Andrews government, you know, have shown over the last 10 years. It's not a perfect system, but it's certainly a more cohesive system than any other state in Australia because of the implementation of these Royal Commission recommendations, but the astonishing funding that the government put into this issue, that was more than the national government and the rest of the states combined. And yet we're still, you know, struggling. And I think that what we should realise is this isn't a problem that we can resolve overnight. And I reflect more on the anti-smoking campaign that has changed my attitude and behaviours towards smoking over my lifetime. And I see that as an example of where we should head with family violence.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the anti-smoking campaign, and I have some intimate knowledge of that whole process through a kind of previous life in consulting, it hit a number of big marks. So, you know, I think business is the most powerful force for good on the planet in the hands of the right leaders, right? Business can do things government can't. I do think sometimes, though, business teaches people that being a little bit aggressive or abusive is how you get ahead. And so, you know, companies could do an awful lot about just how do we conduct ourselves. And I'm not talking about culture and values workshops and things like that. There's no logical argument for anger in the workplace, really, because it's just work, really. You should be able to talk through things. But, you know, there's been a lot of examples in workplaces, businesses, the corporate world, where you get ahead by stepping on people. That is just, you know, that is a starting point for how does that play out elsewhere. And we could be challenging that. So I'm really speaking to all the business leaders, not Rosie. We could immediately start challenging that. We don't have to start programs straight away. You could just be challenging how do we conduct ourselves and how do we show up. The Quit Smoking campaign in Australia has been one of the most successful public health campaigns in the world, but it took 25 years. And it addressed sport. You're no longer advertising cigarettes at sporting events. Interesting. Sports, you know, almost a religious pastime in Australia. So where do people love to go? That's where we're going to actually address this issue. It was addressed through the corporate world. If you can't advertise anymore publicly. They've got to be put in cupboards and hidden away.
And you can't smoke in the workplace.
Yes, and they had advertising almost aimed at children, saying, "Why do you still smoke, Dad or Mum or whatever?" Like but it still took 25 years, right? But you had to get below the surface and think about what's actually really going on. And one of the messages you left in the press club talk was, "But there is hope. We still need to be hopeful, because if you take hope away, things almost seem lost." Definitely, free enterprise business has a role to play. It can do things government can't. People go to work because they need to or want to. People go to sport because they need to or want to. Where can we show up and do this? I'm just wondering, what skills have you gained as a result of being thrust into this role? What skills have you gained that you never imagined yourself ever having need to gain or having gained, prior to this all being launched upon you? You've changed, obviously, as a person, and you clearly have a different level of skills. What skills have you gained that you didn't expect?
Well, I guess, before I lost Luke, well, I didn't lose him. He was murdered. Yes. And you're right, that discomforting language, you tend to use language. But I was in sales and marketing for many years in recruitment. And so I guess I had done a lot of training, speaking, relationship building, and communications was probably my strength. Relationship building. So those are the things I would say I've enhanced and built on. And I don't think I had ever done any real public speaking. And when you consider that whilst I was Australian of the Year in 2015, I spoke at over 250 events. And those were events like conferences, speaking to professional people. And the following year, I spoke at 180. So I think that what I have continued to do is develop my own comfortable speaking style, which is more storytelling, as opposed to working from a script and a written speech. So I draw from, I know my subject, and but I don't, it's an intuitive sense I have, I guess, that I think I continue to build on, how I relate to the audience. I mean, and I'm in my 60s now, so there's many audiences that I have some connection with in some way or another. And so being able to relate to people without turning them away. So I hope, and I think that mostly I may speak with strength, but I don't seek to shame or blame and turn people away. So I hope what I'm able to do is challenge people to want to do something and be part of this act, taking action and being part of the change. And that's what I have been able to do on many levels, is a ripple effect where, I may be speaking at a conference, and for an example, Financial Counselling Australia conference, where a lot of utility companies were there, a lot of banking organisations were there, and in that one event, they all felt, I need to do something. And they went back to their workplace to work out what that could be. And that's how I feel, those changes start. And so that's what I try to do. And people inspire me as well. It's not just a one-way street. I'm often inspired by there's some amazing people doing a lot of great work, and I listen to them and I learn from them as well. And so I feel fortunate. It's a shame that I've had this journey at the cost of losing my son, because if it was in different circumstances, I would say I've had an amazing 10 years. It's just a very, very unfortunate battle that I've had to face to find a way forward after my son was killed. in how do I channel my grief? How do I channel this in a way that feels authentic and real, by being just myself? And and there are people that may have seen me on a day where I haven't been my better self, and I'm that vulnerable human that is frail and isn't that collected, measured person that I mostly am seen to be. And so, I've recently written my book because I wanted people to know the reality of who I am, because no one can be a pedestal person. It's unrealistic, and it's not it's not the real journey. So I've found that by allowing myself my vulnerability to be seen, has been recognized as a strength. It's and all I'm being is myself. And if people see that as being strong, then that's great, because it doesn't necessarily feel like it from the inside. It's just doing your best. It's literally doing your best and just feeling, I will, in my own small contribution to this planet, if this is what I'm able to do that helps me have purpose and meaning in my life at this stage of my life, then that's congruent, I feel, to who I am right now. So it's a work in progress.
Well,
this time next year, I might have given it all away and be on trekking in some wonderful country that I haven't yet discovered, and know that I need to kind of do things a little differently.
You've really laid out a blueprint. People to be better stewards of the planet, better stewards of humanity, and the health of our own planet. They're the two. Humans only care about the future if it has them in it, and so.
Or people they care about.
Yeah, that's true. So we need to be better stewards of humanity and the health of our own planet. But you've laid out a bit of a blueprint. I often find myself saying to people that, communication is the currency of peace. If you don't have communication, you'll probably end up in conflict. And then I started saying communication and contribution are the currency of peace. But I think you've introduced a layer to that, which is this idea of vulnerable but powerful communication is really the currency of peace. I think the vulnerability is a really, really important piece, because people can connect if it's coming from this pedestal position, as you're saying. It's easy to dismiss the person on the pedestal, and therefore it's easy to dismiss the message. And
well, I think that the person on the pedestal is often the person they take down. But I think that if people can relate to you as they need to be able to respect you.
Yes.
But they need to feel that they can be you, or they can trust you, or they can be moved and learn from you. And I guess that's just like I hope that I do to other people.
Yeah.
Except some that I struggle with because I don't share the same values. But I have to learn to practice, how do I respond in this situation, and how do I give space to somebody who may have appalling views, and how do I learn from that, so that there may be a space for them to shift slightly. But while we're, and this is where I think communication is difficult, and perhaps more so now that we kind of communicate so much more via social media. And I mean, the people, I have had nothing but people being absolutely warm, kind, compassionate, respectful people to me. I've had a very, a wonderful experience of the best of human nature. But if I go online and have a look at some of the articles written about me, it doesn't take me 5 seconds to see the other deliberately provocative and deeply insulting and blatantly wrong, but harmful. And I think, where are those people? I don't meet them when I'm out and about. But I think that that shows how deeply unhappy a lot of people are, and in their unhappiness, rather than taking responsibility for how they can have a more meaningful existence, it's about taking people down in whatever way that they can.
And if you take the messenger down, you take the message down too.
Mm.
Some people that don't like the message that's being shared. I think, you know, there's a courage in you and in what you're doing, and the circumstances are tragic. The price is too high, far too high. But knowing a little bit about your background and, you know, having been involved in marketing and recruitment and things like that, you know, we need to do two things to make change happen. We need to equip people and we need to resource it. They're the two things we generally always need to do. And you were probably equipped with some skills that allowed you to step into the frame when this was thrust upon you, and when many others wouldn't. And for people that want to make change happen, for people that want to influence the world, and you say, but I don't like speaking, I don't want to get out in front of an audience, it goes with the territory. You know, if you want to actually make big change, you do have to put yourself out there. Vulnerability becomes an issue and you'll become a target. But if you really want to make a difference, those things go with the territory. And Rosie, I think you're an Australian treasure. I think most people, or probably everyone I know, would agree with that. The price was way too high, but the insights that you have about how do you make big change happen, and it isn't superficial. It's not the quick fix tips, tricks, and tactics that everyone's searching in the world today. It's going deep. What's the wisdom behind this thing? What do we really need to figure out, and how are we going to actually influence a whole lot of people and make that change happen, is the perpetual challenge on big and difficult conversations. But we're better off for you, you know, being one of the people that led that conversation right from the start. And there's a whole lot of, I mean, I could talk all day with you about the journey and what could we learn about stewardship and everything else, but we've got limited time. So I just want to thank you. I want to thank everybody that stayed with the show all the way through the show, and either, you know, on the recording, because there's absolute gold. Go and look up Rosie Batty and find out more about the journey, because there's real stewardship on show here. And as Rosie said, this is for the grandchildren. This is, you know, her work is for multiple generations. And so even if we hadn't had the conversation, people are just witnessing stewardship in action. And I think that's the key thing. So Rosie, I just want to thank you for giving us this time today. And I know that, you know, sometimes these can be really challenging conversations, and especially, you know, for you, depending on what's happening, as you said, on a good day or a bad day. So it's been a pretty great day for me. I've found it really, really interesting and fascinating. I could talk to you all day about it, but I must let you go. It's evening time for you, and thank everybody for watching the show. And here's my challenge to everybody that's just watched this show. If you're a business leader, think about how your company shows up in the first place. And is your company perpetuating little kind of below the surface behaviors that sort of signal to people you climb to the top by stepping on other people, that you actually rise by pushing other people down? Is your company really actually supporting people in a way that allows them to even just raise their hand and say, you know, I don't know where to turn, but I've got a risk. They spend a lot of time with you. Is there any way someone could raise their hand if they had to? You know, a woman or anyone in that matter who's being subjected to some level of violence from people that they should be able to trust. If you're a political leader and you're listening to this, speed is your responsibility. You know, the job of the political leadership in these kinds of situations is to make the changes that we're talking about happen as fast as we possibly can, not as slow as we can. So how are we going to equip this and resource it? If you're a community leader, you're leading sporting bodies and charities and things like that, it's communication. How do you get everyone as aware about this as you possibly can whilst they're involved in the things that they love to do, whether it's sport or the arts or whatever? But there is a single unifying conversation here that has to be had to address the problem and make it no longer the norm, if you like. 1 in 4 children, 1 in 3 women, and currently, as we record this episode, 1 every 4 days murdered in Australia. And I don't know what the numbers are around the rest of the world, but Rosie, it's a call to action, And it's a call to action you've stimulated through our conversation. So I really, really appreciate that. And I want to thank you for coming and spending this time with us.
Thank you, Simon.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.